People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos is a D.B. Spitzer production, recorded and edited by D.B. Spitzer. Find out more about the show at pgttcm.podbean.com or check out the blog at peoplesguidetothecthulhumythos.wordpress.com. The People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos, Season 2, Episode 11, Worms. Don't you ever laugh as a hearse goes by, for you may be the next one to die. They wrap you up in big white sheets and cover you from your head to your feet. They put you in a little box, and they cover you with dirt and rocks. All goes well for about a week until your coffin begins to leak. The worms crawl in, the worms crawl out. The worms play pinochle in your snout. They eat your eyes, they eat your nose, they eat the jelly between your toes. A big green worm with rolling eyes crawls in your stomach and out your sides. Your stomach turns a slimy green, and pus pours out like whipping cream. You'll spread it on a slice of bread, and that's what you eat when you're dead. This, of course, is from the hearse song. A hearse song is a song about burial and decomposition. It was popular in World War I and began to spread throughout English-speaking countries because of the fact that it was sung by American and British soldiers. Primarily in the Crimean Wars is where it is reported to have started, and then spread around World War I. Most people nowadays know these words from either the playground, other children, television shows, whatnot, cartoons. And most people, most modern version of the hearse song is from Stories to... Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark by Alvin Schwartz. Yes. And that leads us to what we're talking about today. Worms. We're talking about worms. Worms in horror. Worms in science fiction. Worms in the Cthulhu mythos. Why? Why not? I mean... Actually, no, there is a reason why. We are going through the Cthulhu mythos chronologically, not as it was written, but from the Big Bang to the Big Crunch. We will be talking about the Cthulhu mythos. Who showed up first? Who showed up where? Today we get to talk about worms. The exquisite corpse drinks the fine wine. The exquisite corpse drinks the fine wine. It's very much generally just called the exquisite corpse. It's a word and or picture game where you fold a piece of paper 3 ways. One person writes one thing, one person writes one thing, another person writes another thing. You have no idea what the other person's writing, and it is a collaborative effort. A fun way to tell a story, but not always the greatest or strongest story. It's a step up from Mad Libs. Sometimes it's like Red Robin story writing. There's different ways that people refer to this. I wanted to just call it Exquisite Corpse because that's how I'm familiar with it. Plus, it's a little bit spookier. The 3rd anniversary issue of, what was it called? Fantasy Magazine? Yeah. 3rd anniversary issue of Fantasy Magazine featured something called The Challenge from Beyond. They did a weird fiction and a straight-up science fiction version of a story. It's round-robin stories from Fantasy Magazine. The one that we'll be talking about had Catherine Lucille Moore, Abraham Merritt, H.P. Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard, and Frank Belknap Long wrote a short story together. I'm not sure why this was considered a great idea. I mean, I understand, like, a collaborative effort, but this round-robin thing just seemed kind of... I don't know. The following part is taken from Project Gutenberg, Australia.
The Challenge from Beyond by C.L. Moore, A. Merritt, H.P. Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard, Frank Belknap Long. The Challenge from Beyond. Written in August 1935, first published in Fantasy Magazine, September 1935. If I said 1939 earlier, I was mistaken. In 1935, the editor of Fantasy Magazine asked 5 prominent science fiction writers and 5 prominent fantasy writers to write 2 round-robin stories, both called The Challenge from Beyond. The authors of the fantasy versions were C.L. Moore, A. Merritt, H.P. Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard, and Frank Belknap Long. The science fiction version was written by Stanley G. Weinbaum, Donnie Wandry, Edward E. Smith, E.E. Doct, Hal Vincent, and Murray Leinster. In the following text, the name of the author of each section of the story is given in brackets. We will only be covering the fantasy one, as it is the one that actually has anything to do with the Cthulhu mythos. George Campbell opened sleep-fogged eyes upon darkness and lay gazing out of the tent flap upon the pale August night for some minutes before he roused enough even to wonder what had wakened him. There was in the keen clean of these Canadian woods a soporific as potent as any drug. Campbell lay quiet for a moment, sinking slowly back into the delicious borderlands of sleep, consciousness, of exquisite weariness, an unaccustomed sense of the muscles well used and relaxed now in perfect ease. These were vacation's most delightful moments after all. Rest after toil, in the clear, sweet forest night. Luxuriously as his mind sank backward into oblivion, he assured himself once more that the 3 long months of freedom lay before him. Freedom from the cities and monotony, freedom from the pedagogy of the university and the students with no rudiments of interest in the geology he earned his daily bread by dining into their obdurate ears. Freedom from, abruptly, the delightful Solomons crashed about him. Somewhere outside, the sound of tin shrieking across tin slashed his peace. George Campbell sat up jerkily and reached for his flashlight. Then he laughed and put it down again. Straining his eyes through the midnight gloom outside, there was, among the tumbling cans of the supplies of his dark, anonymous night beast, was prowling. He stretched out his long arms and groped out for some rocks at the tent door for a missile. His fingers closed on a large stone and he drew back his hand to throw. But he never threw it. It was such a queer thing he had come upon in the dark. Square crystal, smooth, obviously artificial, with dull rounded corners. The strangeness of the rock surfaces to his fingers was so remarkable that he reached again with his flashlight and turned its rays upon the thing he held. All sleeplessness left him as he saw what it was he picked up in his idle groping. It was clear as rock crystal, this queer, smooth cube, quartz unquestionably, but not in its unusual hexagonal crystalline form. Somehow, he could not guess the method. It had been wrought into a perfect cube, about 4 inches in measurement over each worn face. For it was incredibly worn, but hard. Hard crystal was rounded now until its corners were almost gone, and the thing was beginning to assume the outlines of a spear. Ages and ages of wearing, years, almost beyond counting, must have passed over this strange, clear thing. But the most curious thing of all was the shape he could make out dimly in the heart of the crystal. For embedded in the center was a little disk of pale, nameless substance with characters incised deep upon its quartz-enclosed surface, wedge-shaped characters faintly reminiscent of cruciform writing. George Campbell wrinkled his brow and bent closer above the little enigma in his hands, puzzling helplessly. How could such a thing as this have embedded in pure rock crystal? Remotely, a memory floated through his mind of ancient legends that called quartz crystal ice, which had frozen so hard to melt again. Ice, the wedge-shaped cruciforms, yes. Didn't that sort of writing originate among the Sumerians who came down from the north in history's remotest beginnings to settle in the primitive Mesopotamian valley? Then hard sense regained control and he laughed. Quartz, of course, was formed in the earliest of Earth's geological periods when there was nothing anywhere but beat and heaving rock. Ice had not come from tens of millions after this thing had been formed. And yet a writing, man-made, surely, although its characteristics were unfamiliar save the faint hinting at cruciform shapes. Or could there, in a Paleozoic world, been things with a written language who might have graven these cryptic wedges upon the quartz envelope he held? Or might this, might a thing like this have fallen meteor-like out of space into the unformed rock of a still molten world? Could it? Then he caught himself sharply as he felt his ears going hot with the luridness of his own imagination. The silence of the solitude of the queer things in his hands were conspiring to play tricks with his common sense. He shrugged and laid the crystal down at the edge of his pallet, switched off the light. Perhaps morning and a clear head would bring an answer to the questions that seemed insoluble now. But sleep did not come easily. For one thing, it seemed to him, as he flashed off the light, that the little cube had shone for a moment, as if with sustained light before it faded into the surrounding dark. Or perhaps he was wrong. Perhaps it had only his eyes dazzled with what had seemed light forsake its reluctancy, glowing in the enigmatic depths of the thing with queer persistence. He lay there unquietly for a long time, turning the unanswered questions over and over in his mind. There was something about the crystal cube, out of the unmeasured past, perhaps from the dawn of all history, that constituted a challenge that would not let him sleep. Amerit. He lay there, in sleep for him for hours. It had been the lingering light, the luminescence that seemed so reluctant to die, which he held in his mind. It was though something in his heart of the cube had awakened, stirred drowsily, become suddenly alert, and intent upon him. Sheer fantasy, this. He stirred impatiently, flashed his light towards his watch. Closed to 1 o'clock, 3 hours before the dawn. The beam fell and focused upon the warm crystal cube. He held it there closely. For minutes, he snapped it out, then watched. There was no doubt about it now. As his eyes accustomed themselves to the darkness, he saw the strange crystal was glimmering with tiny fugitive lights deep within, like little strands of sapphire lightings. There were at its center, and they seemed to him to come from the pale disk within its disturbing markings. And the disk itself had become larger, the markings shifting shapes. The cube was growing. Was it illusion brought about by the tiny lightings? He heard a sound. It was the very ghost of a sound, like the ghost of harp strings being plucked with ghostly fingers. He bent closer. It came from the cube. There was squeaking in the underbrush, a flurry of bodies, an antagonized wailing like a child in death throes, and swiftly stilled. Some small tragedy of the wilderness, killer and prey. He stepped over to where it had been enacted, but could see nothing. He again snapped off his flash and looked around toward his tent. Upon the ground was a pale blue glimmering. It was the cube. He stooped to pick it up, then, obeying some obscure warning, drew back his hand. And again he saw its glow was dying, the tiny sapphire lightings flashing fitfully, withdrawing into the disk from which they had come. There was no sound from it. He sat, watching the luminescence grow and fade and grow and fade, but steadily becoming dimmer. It came to him that two elements were necessary to produce the phenomenon: the electric ray itself and his own fixed attention. What mind must travel along the ray, fix itself upon the cube's heart, if its beat were to wax until... what? He felt a chill of spirit as though from contract from some alien thing. It was alien, he knew it, not of this earth, not of Earth's life. He conquered his shrieking, picked up the cube, and took it into the tent. It was neither warm nor cold except for its weight. He could not have known he held it. He put it upon the table, keeping the torch turned from it, then stepped to the flap of the tent and closed it. He went back to the table, drew up the camp chair, and turned the flash directly upon the cube, focusing it far as he could upon its heart. He sent all his will, all his concentration along it, focusing will and sight upon the disk as he had the light. As though at command, the sapphire lighting burned forth. They burst from the disk into the body of the crystalline cube, then back, bathing the disk and the markings. Again these began to change, shifting, moving, advancing, retreating in the blue gleaming. They were no longer cruciform. They were things, objects. He heard the murmuring inside, the plucked harp strings. Louder grew the sound, louder, and now the body of the cube vibrated to the rhythm. The crystal walls were melting, growing misty as though formed of the mist of diamonds, and the disk itself was growing, the shapes shifting, dividing and multiplying as though some door had been opened into it. Companies of phantasms were pouring, while brighter, more bright, grew the pulsing light. He felt swift panic. He tried to withdraw the sight and will and dropped the flash. The cube had no need now for the ray, and he could not withdraw. Could not withdraw? Why, he himself had been sucked into the disk, which was now a globe, which within the unnameable shapes danced to a music that bathed the globe in a steady radiance. There was no tent. There was only a vast curtain of sparkling mist which shone the globe. He felt himself drawn through that mist, sucked through as if by a mighty wind, straight into the globe. H.P. Lovecraft. As the mist-blurred night of the sapphire suns grew more and more intense, the outline of the globe ahead wavered and dissolved into a churning chaos. Its pallor and its motion and its music all blended themselves with the engulfing mist bleaching it to a pale steel color and setting its unduary in motion. And the sapphire suns too melted imperfectibly into the great infinity of shapeless pulsation. Meanwhile, the sense of forward-outward motion grew intolerably, incredibly, cosmically swift. Every standard of speed known to Earth seemed dwarfed, and Campbell knew that such a flight in physical reality would mean instant death to a human being. Even as it was strange, hellish hypnosis or nightmare, the quasi-visual impersonation of meteor-like hurtling towards paralyzed his mind. Though there were no real points of reference in the gray pulsating void, he felt that he was approaching and passing the speed of light itself. Finally, his consciousness did not go under, and the merciful blackness swallowed everything. It was very suddenly and amidst the most impenetrable darkness that thoughts and ideas again came to George Campbell. Of what many moments or years or eternities had elapsed since his flight through the gray void, he could not estimate. He knew only that it seemed to be at rest without pain. Indeed, the absence of all physical sensation was the salient quality of his condition. It made even the blackness seem less solidly black, suggesting it did that he was rather a disembodied intelligence in a state beyond physical sense than a corporeal being with senses deprived of their accustomed objects of perception. He could think sharply and quickly, almost preternaturally so, yet could form no idea whatsoever of his situation. Half by instinct, he realized he was not in his own tent. True, he might have awakened there from a nightmare to a world equally black, yet he knew this was not so. There was no camp cot beneath him. He had no hands to feel the blankets and the canvas surface and the flashlight that ought to be around him. There was no sensation of cold in the air, no flap which he could glimpse the pale night outside. Something was wrong, dreadfully wrong. He cast his mind backward and thought of the fluorescent cube which had hypnotized him, of that and that which had followed. He had known that his mind was going, yet had been unable to draw back. At the last moment, there had been a shocking panic fear, a subconscious fear beyond that even caused a sensation of demonic flight. It had come from some vague flash or remote recollection. Just what, he could not tell. Some cell group in the back of his head had seemed to find a cloudy, familiar quality in the cube, and that familiarity was fraught with dim terror. Now he tried to remember the familiarity and the terror were. Little by little it came to him. Once, long ago, in connection with his geological life work, he had read something of that cube. It had to do with those debatable and disquieting clay fragments called the Eltdown shards, dug up from pre-Cambriferous strata in southern England 30 years prior. Their shape and their markings were so queer that a few scholars hinted at artificially and made wild conjectures about them and their origin. They came clearly from a time where no human being could exist on the globe, but their contours and their figuring were damnably puzzling. That is how they got their name. It was not, however, in the writings of any sober scientist that Campbell had seen the reference to a crystal disc-holding globe. The source was far less reputable and infinitely more valid. About 1912, a deeply learned Sussex clergyman of occultism learnings, the Reverend Arthur Broke Winters Hall, had professed to identify the markings on the Eltdown shards with some of the so-called pre-human hieroglyphs, persistently cherished and esoterically handed down in certain mystical circles, and had published at his own expense what portrayed to be a translation of the primal and baffling inscriptions, a translation still quoted frequently and seriously by occult readers. In this translation, a surprisingly long brochure in view of the limited number of shards existing had occurred. The narrative, supposedly of pre-human authorship, containing the now frightening reference. As the story went, there dwelt on a world, and eventually on countless other worlds, of outer space, a mighty order of worm-like beings, whose attainments and whose control of nature surpassed anything within the range of terrestrial imagination. They had mastered the art of interstellar travel early in their career, and had peopled every habitable planet in their own galaxy, killing off the races they found. Beyond the limit of their own galaxy, which was not ours, they could not navigate in person, but in their quest for knowledge of all space and time, they discovered a means of spanning certain transgalactic gulfs with their minds. They devised objects, strangely energized cubes, of a curious crystal containing hypnotic talismans, and enclosed in space-resisting spherical envelopes of unknown substance, which could be forcibly expelled beyond the limits of their universe, and which could respond to the attraction of cool, solid matter only. These of which a few would necessarily land on various inhabitable worlds in outside universes formed by the ether bridges needed for mental communications. Atmospheric friction burned away the protecting envelope, leaving the cube exposed and subject to discovery by the intelligent minds of the world where they fell. But in its very nature, the cube would attract and rivet attention. This, then coupled with the action of light, was sufficient, set with special properties working. The mind noticed the cube would be drawn into by the power of the disk, and would be sent on a thread of obscure energy to the place whence the disk had come, the remote world of the worm-like space explorers across stupendous galactic abysses, received in one of the machines to which each cube was attuned. The captured mind would remain suspended without body or senses until examined by one of the dominant race. Then, by an obscure process of interchange, be pumped of all of its contents. The investigator's mind would now occupy the strange machine, while captive mind occupied the interrogator's worm-like body. Then, in another interchange, the interrogator's mind would leap across boundless space to the captive vacant and unconscious body of the transgalactic world, animating the alien tenement as best as it might, and exploring the alien world in the guise of one of its denizens. When done with exploration, the adventurer would use the cube and its disk in accomplishing its return, and sometimes the captured mind would be restored safely to its own remote world, not always, however, when the dominant race so kind. Sometimes, when a potentially important race capable of space travel was found, the worm-like folk would employ the cube to capture and annihilate minds by the thousands that would extirpate the race for dominant reasons, using the exploring minds as agents of destruction. In other races, sections of the worm folk would permanently occupy transgalactic planet, destroying the captured minds and wiping out the remaining inhabitants, preparatory to settling down in familiar bodies. Never, however, could the parent civilization be quite duplicated in such a case, since the new planet would not contain all the materials necessary for the worm race arts. The cubes, for example, could only be made by the home planet. Only a few of the numberless cubes sent forth ever found a landing and response on an annihilated world, since there was no such thing as aiming them at goals beyond sight or knowledge. Only 3 ran the story, had ever landed on peopled worlds in our particular universe. One of these had struck a planet near the galactic rim 2,000 billion years ago, while another lodged 3 billion years ago on a world rather near the center of the galaxy. The third, and the only one ever known to have invaded the solar system, had reached our own Earth 1,500 billion years ago. It was with this latter what Dr. Winter Hall's translation chiefly dealt. When the cube struck the Earth, he wrote, the ruling terrestrial species was a huge cone-shaped race, surpassing all others before or since in mentality and achievements. This race was so advanced that they had actually sent minds abroad in both space and time to explore the cosmos. Hence recognized something of what had happened when the cube fell from the sky, and certain individuals had suffered mental change after gazing at it. Realizing that the changed individuals represent invading minds, the race's leaders had them destroyed, even at the cost of leaving the displaced minds exiled in alien space. They had experience with even stranger transitions. When through a mental exploration of space and time, they formed a rough idea of what the cube was. They certainly hid the thing from light and sight and guarded it as a menace. They did not wish to destroy such a rich in their experimental possibilities. Now and then, some rash, unscrupulous adventurer would futurely gain access to it and sample its perilous powers despite the consequences. But all such cases were discovered and safely and drastically dealt with. Of this evil meddling, the only bad result was the worm-like outsider race learned from the new exiles that had happened to their explorers on Earth, and convinced a violent hatred of the planet and all of its life forms. They would have depopulated it if they could, and indeed sent additional cubes into space in the wild hope of striking it by accident in unguarded places, but that accident never came to pass. The cone-shaped terrestrial beings kept one existing cube in a special shrine as a relic and basis for experiments, till after eons it was lost amid the chaos of the war and the destruction of the great polar city where it was guarded. When 50 million years ago, the beings sent their minds ahead into the infinite future to avoid the perilous peril of inner Earth. The whereabouts of the sinister cube from space were unknown. This much according to the learned occultist, the Eldrin Shards had said. What now made the account so obscurely frightful to Campbell was the minute accuracy which the alien cube had been described. Minute accuracy in which the alien cube had been described. Every detail tallied: dimensions, consistency, hieroglyphed central disk, hypnotic effect. As he thought the matter over and over amidst the darkness of his strange situation, he began to wonder whether his whole experience with the crystal cube, indeed its very existence, were not a nightmare brought on by some freakish subconscious memory of this old bit of extravagant reading. If so, the nightmare must still be in force, since his present apparently bodiless state had nothing of normality in it. Of the time consumed by the puzzled memory and reflection, Campbell could not estimate. Everything about his state was so unreal that ordinary dimensions and measurements had become meaningless. It seemed an eternity, but perhaps it was not really long before the sudden interruption came. What happened was as strange and inexplicable as the blackness it succeeded. There was a sensation of the mind rather than the body, and at once Campbell felt his thoughts swept or sucked through beyond his control in tumultuous and chaotic fashion. Memories arose irresponsibly and irrelevantly. Scratching junk out of my eye. All that he knew of his personal background, traditions, experiences, scholarship, dreams, ideas, and inspirations welled up abruptly and simultaneously with a dizzying speed and abundance, which soon made him feel unable to keep track of any separate concept. The parade of his mental contents became an avalanche, a cascade, a vortex. It was horrible and fastidious at his hypnotic flight through space, which the crystal cube pulled him. Finally, it sapped his consciousness and brought on fresh oblivion. Another measureless blank. And then a slow trickle of sensation. This time it was physical, not mental. Sapphire light, a low rumble of distant sound. There were tactile impersonations. There were tactile impressions. He could realize that he was lying at full length on something, though there was a baffling strangeness about the feel of his posture. He could not reconcile the pressure of the supporting surface with his own outlines, or the outlines of the human form at all. He had tried to move his arms, but found no definite response to the attempt. Instead, there were ineffectual nervous twitches all over the area which seemed to mark his body. He tried to open his eyes more widely, but found himself unable to control their mechanism. The sapphire light came in a diffused, nebulous manner. He could nowhere be voluntarily focused into definition. Gradually, though, visual images began to trickle in curiously and indecisively. The limits and qualities of vision were not those which he was used to, but he could roughly correlate the sensation with what he had known as sight. As this sensation gained some degree of stability, Campbell realized he must now be in the throes of a nightmare. He seemed to be in a room considerably extent, of medium height, with a large proportionate area. On every side he could apparently see all four sides at once, were high, narrowish slits, which seemed to serve as combined doors and windows. There were singular low tables or pedestals, but no furniture of normal structure and proportion. Through these slits steamed floods of sapphire light, and beyond them could be mistily seen the sides of roofs of fantastic buildings like clustered cubes. On the walls, in the vertical panels between the slits, were strange markings, of an oddly disquieting character. In some time before Campbell understood why they disturbed him so, then he saw what they were, in repeated instances precisely like some of the hieroglyphs on the cube's inner disk. The actual nightmare element, though, was something more than this. It began with the living thing which presently entered through one of the slits, advancing deliberately towards him and bearing a metal box of some bizarre proportions, glassy, mirror-like substances. For this thing was nothing human, nothing of earth, nothing even of man's myths and dreams. It was a gigantic pale worm or centipede, as large round as a man and twice as long, with a disc-like, apparently eyeless, cilia-fringed head bearing a purple central orifice. It glided on its rear pairs of legs, which its fore part raised vertically. The legs, or at least two pairs of them, served as arms. Along the spinal ridge was a curious purple comb, and a fan-shaped tail with some gray membrane ended at its grotesque bulk. There was a ring of flexible red spikes around its neck, and from the twistings of these came clicking, twanging sounds in measured, deliberate rhythms. They were indeed, was Outre nightmare at its height, caprious fantasy at its apex. But even this vision of delirium was not what confused George Campbell to lapse a third time into unconsciousness. It took one more thing, one final unbearable touch, to do that. As the nameless worm advanced its glistening box, the reclining man caught in the mirror-like surface a glimpse of what could have been his own body, yet horribly verifying his disoriented and unfamiliar sensations. It was not his own body that he saw reflected in the burnished metal. It was in fact the loathsome, pale gray bulk of one of the great centipedes. Robert E. Howard. From that final leap of senselessness he emerged with a full understanding of his situation. His mind was imprisoned in the body of a frightful native of an alien planet, while somewhere on the other side of the universe his own body was housing the monster's personality. He fought down unreasoning horror. Judged from a cosmic standpoint, why should his metamorphosis horrify him? Life and consciousness were only realities in the universe. Form was unimportant. His present body was hideous, and only according to terrestrial standards. Fear and revulsion were drowned in the excitement of titanic adventure. What was his former body but a cloak, eventually to be cast off by death anyway? He had no sentimental illusions about the life form which had been exiled. What had it ever given him save toil, poverty, continual frustration, and repression? If this life before him offered no more, at least it offered no less. Intuition told him it offered more, much more. With the honesty possible only when life is stripped to its naked fundamentals, he realized that he remembered with pleasure only the physical delights of his former life, but had long ago exhausted all the physical possibilities contained in that earthly body. Earth held no thrills, but in the possession of this new alien body he felt promises of strange, exotic joys. A lawless exultation rose in him. He was a man without a world, free of all conventions or inhibitions of Earth, or this strange planet, free of every artificial restraint in the universe. He was a god. With grim amusement he thought of his body moving in Earth's business and society, with all while an alien monster staring out at the windows that were George Campbell's eyes on people who would flee if they knew. Let him walk the earth, slaying and destroying as he would. Earth and its races no longer had any meaning to George Campbell. There he had been one of billion non-entities fixed in place by a mountainous accumulation of conventions, laws, and manners, doomed to live and die in his sordid niche. But in one blind bound, he had soared above the commonplace. This was not death, but rebirth. The birth of a full-grown mentality and a newfound freedom that made little of physical captivity on Yakub. He started. Yakub. It was the name of this planet. But how had he known? Then he knew, as he knew the name of him whose body he occupied, Thoth. Memory deep-grooved in Thoth's brain was stirring in him. Shadows of the knowledge Thoth had. Carved deep in the physical tissues of his brain, they spoke dimly as implanted instincts to George Campbell, and his human consciousness seized them and translated them to show him the way not only to safety and freedom, but to power his soul, stripped of its primitive impulses, craved. Not as a slave he would dwell on Yakub, but as a king, just as of old barbarians had sat on the throne of lordly empires. For the first time he turned his attention to his surroundings. He still lay on the couch-like thing in the midst of the fantastic room, and the centipede man stood before him holding the polished metal object, clashing its neck spikes. Thus it spoke to him. Campbell knew what it was saying. He dimly understood, though the implanted thought process of Thoth, just as he knew the creature was Yakuth, supreme lord of science. But Campbell gave no heed, for he had made his desperate plan, a plan so alien to the ways of Yakub that it was beyond Yakuth's comprehension, and caught him wholly unprepared. Yakuth, like Campbell, saw the sharp-pointed metal spear on a nearby table, but to Yakuth it was only a scientific implement. He did not even know it could be used as a weapon. Campbell's earthly mind supplied the knowledge and the action that followed, driving Thoth's body into movements no man of Yakub had ever made before. Campbell snatched the pointed shard, struck it, ripping savagely upward. Yakuth reared and toppled, his entrails spilling out on the floor. In an instant, Campbell was streaking for the door. His speed was amazing, exhilarating. First, fulfillment of promise of novel physical sensations. As he ran, guided wholly by the instinctive knowledge implanted in Thoth's physical reflexes, it was as if he was borne by a separate consciousness of his legs. Thoth's body was bearing him along a route it had traversed 10,000 times when animated by Thoth's mind. Down a winding corridor he raced, up a twisted stair, through a carved door, and the same instincts that had brought him there told him he had found what he had sought. He was in a circular room with a domed roof from which shone a livid blue light. A strange structure rose in the middle of the rainbow-hued floor, tier on tier, each of a separate vivid color. The ultimate tier was a purple cone, from the apex of which a blue smoky mist drifted upward to a sphere poised in midair, a sphere that shone like translucent ivory. This, the deep-grooved memories of Thoth told Campbell, was the god of Yakub. Though why the people of Yakub feared and worshipped it had been forgotten a billion years. A worm priest stood between him and the altar, which had no hand of flesh had ever touched. That it could be touched was a blasphemy that had never occurred to a man of Yakub. The worm priest stood in frozen horror until Campbell's shard ripped the life out of him. On his centipede legs clambered the tiered altar, heedless of its sudden quiverings, heedless of the change that was taking place in the floating sphere, heedless of the smoke that now billowed out in blue clouds. He was drunk with the feel of power, He feared the superstitions of Yakeb no more than he feared those of Earth. With the globe in his hands, he would be the king of Yakeb. The worm men dare deny him nothing. When he held their god as hostage, he reached a hand for the ball, no longer ivory-hued, but red as blood. Out of the tent, into the pale August night, walked the body of George Campbell. It moved with a slow, wavering gait between the bodies of enormous trees, over a forest path strewn with sweet-scented pine needles. The air was crisp and cool. The sky was an inverted bowl of silver flecked with stardust. And far to the north was the aurora borealis, splashed streamers with fire. The head of the walking man lolled hideously from side to side. From the corners of his lax mouth drooled thick threads of amber froth, which fluttered in the night breeze. He walked upright at first, as a man should walk, but gradually, as the tent receded, his posture altered. His torso began almost imperceptibly to slant, and his limbs to shorten. In a far-off world of outer space, the centipede creature that was George Campbell clasped to its bosom a god whose lineaments were red as blood, and ran with insect-like quiverings across a rainbow-hued hall and out through a massive portal into the bright glow of alien sun, wavering between the trees of Earth in an attitude that suggested the awkward loping of a werebeast. The body of George Campbell was fulfilling a mindless destiny. Long, short-tipped fingers dragged leaves from a carpet of odorous pine needles as it moved toward a wide expanse of gleaming water. In the far-off extragalactic world of the Worm people, George Campbell moved between cyclopean blocks of black masonry, down long, fern-planted avenues holding aloft round, red god. There was a harsh animal cry in the underbrush near the gleaming lake of Earth, where the mind of a worm creature in a body swayed by instinct. Human teeth sank into soft animal fur and tore at black animal flesh. A little silver fox sank its fangs in frantic retaliation into a furry human wrist and thrashed about in terror as its blood splurted. Slowly the body of George Campbell arose, its mouth splashed with fresh blood. With upper limbs swaying oddly, it moved towards the waters of the lake as the veriform creature that was George Campbell crawled between the black blocks of stone. Thousands of worm-shaped prostrated themselves in scintillating dust before it. A godlike power seemed to emanate from its weaving body as it moved with a slow, undulant motion towards the throne of spiritual empire transcending all sovereignties of Earth. A trapper stumbling wearily through the dense woods of the Earth near the tent where the worm creature dwelt in the body of George Campbell came to the gleaming waters of the lake and discerned something dark floating there. He had been lost in the woods all night, and weariness enveloped him like a laden cloak in the pale morning light. But the shape was a challenge that he could not ignore. Moving to the edge of the water, he knelt in the soft mud and reached towards the floating bulk. Slowly, he pulled it to the shore. Far off in outer space, the worm creature holding the red god ascended a throne that gleamed like a constellation Cassiopeia under an alien vault of hyper-suns. The great deity that he held aloft energized his worm tenement, burning away in white fire of a supermundane spirituality all animal dross. On Earth, the trapper gazed with unutterable horror into the blackened, hairy face of a drowned man. It was a bestial face, repulsively anthropod in contour, and from its twisted, distorted black mouth ichor poured. He who sought your body in the abysses of time will occupy an unresponsive tenement, said the Red God. No spawn of Yakub can control the body of a human. On Earth, living things rend one another and feast with unutterable cruelty on their kith and kin. No warm mind can control a bestial man-body when it yearns to raven. Only man-minds instinctively conditioned through the course of 10,000 generations can keep the human instincts in thrall. Your body will destroy itself on Earth, seeking the blood of its animal kin, seeking the cool water where it can wallow in its ease, seeking eventually destruction, for the death instinct is more powerful in it than the instincts of life, and will destroy itself in seeking to return to the slime from which it sprang. Thus spoke the Red Gob of Yakub, in a far-off segment of time-space continuum, to George Campbell as the latter. With all human desire purged away, he sat on the throne, ruled an empire of worms more wisely, kindly, and benevolently than any man of Earth had ever ruled an empire of men. The end.
Again, that was Challenge from Beyond from the 3rd anniversary of Fantasy Magazine, September 1935. And also, I would like to point out that this is People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos, hosted by D.B. Spitzer. Thank you for listening, and you can find out more about this show at pgttcm.podbean.com or check out the blog at peoplesguidetothecthulhumythos.wordpress.com. Thank you for your support. Check out the shops at the blog and also on the podcast page. You can like us on Facebook if you'd like. You can follow us on Twitter, and if you're on the YouTube, we're also there. Not as much as we'd like to be, but we are there. Subscribe and give us 5 stars on iTunes if you feel like it. But if you don't want to wait for the iTunes update every time this podcast comes out, you should check out the Podbean app. Go to podbean.com, download their app. It's available for iPhones and Androids. Hey! So, how about that story we just listened to? Well, Worms is pretty cool. I mean, it was very Robert E. Howard and the Robert E. Howard parts. It was very Lovecraft and the Lovecraft parts. And I'll say it was very Frank Belknap Long and the Frank Belknap Long parts. The first 2 authors I am not all that familiar with, but you should check them out. They've got more stuff. Pretty cool. So, when I was thinking about an episode about to do with Yakubians, I thought to myself, well, should I do one about camping, werewolves, cubes? Because I could do, part on the Yakubians and then the other part on Christian Slater move, Gleaming the Cube, A Brother's Love. One of the seminal skateboarding movies of the late 90s. I thought of all kinds of things I could do with this, and then it came to me, what about worms? And then I thought, what if I do Challenge of the Champions, or, sorry, that was a spin-off of Super Friends. What if I did Challenge from Beyond and Night of the Creeps? Hey, hey. And then it became hard to find a copy of Night of the Creeps. And then I thought to myself, wait a minute, those are slugs. But then again, they're more like centipedes in this. And then I thought, well, we can do better than Night of the Creeps. Night of the Creeps is just a zombie movie with slugs. It is very Lovecrafty in many elements, but I don't know. There's other stuff that we could do that's better. And that's when I thought about two of my favorite worms. Graboids from the film Tremors, and the sandworms from Dune. And if anyone's been paying attention to either me on social media or occasionally here, Dune's kind of like, okay, you know how people have that movie that they've seen like 1 billion times and they'll watch it, they've owned it on VHS, DVD, whatever? For me, that is the super long copy of Dune. I had a copy. I've had multiple copies of the long version, bootleg versions. It's the best. It's the best way to go. And I currently don't have a copy of the long cut of Dune, but I'll get one of these days. It's really important for me for folding laundry. I haven't folded laundry in like 10 years because of the fact that I haven't had a decent copy of Dune to watch. All my laundry piles up around me, unfolded, unlaundered, just everything's just going to hell. Remember, kids, fold your laundry, or you could be living in a laundry fortress such as I do. But great thing about a laundry fortress, you always know where your laundry is. Bad thing about a laundry fortress, awful acoustics.
Do not speak, listen. You do not have more time than this one chance. I represent the entire guild in this matter. Our navigators warn you that spice production is in great danger. A new friend and leader, Moradin, has stopped spice mining on Arrakis. Our navigators suggest he is not of Arrakis. Not one on the outside world has been able to see him. We do not know who he is. The Harkoonans cannot stop him. Remedy this situation. Restore spice production, or you will live out your life in a pain amplifier.
As a kid, one of my favorite movies was Dune. I mentioned that, and I didn't think there was anyone cooler than the Spacing Guild, or the Spice Guild Navigator folks with their cool black outfits. Almost as cool as Darth Vader. Anyhow, the worm guy totally grossed me out and enthralled me as a kid, as much did the Baron Harkonnen. But one thing I loved, is the concept of still suits and riding sandworms. I have no idea why that idea of anything clung to me. Not a huge fan of bugs. It's not like I'm grossed out by worms and bugs and spiders. In fact, I actually think spiders are awesome. But I'm not a great fan of the desert. Brightness. And there's only one person who dislikes sand. Enough of that. Let's talk about some sandworms. So, the Fremen call them Shai-Hulud. So let's talk about Shai-Hulud. And like many things that I have covered in this show, there is also a heavy metal band, or a doom metal, death metal, some sort of metal band, so, that has a very specific genre, follows this naming convention of things, of science fiction fantasy concepts of massive things, intense things to name your band. And if I was a bunch of large bearded men with electric instruments, I might want to go with Shai-Hulud. I know nothing of their music. I just noticed the fact that, much like everything else that I cover, there is a metal band associated with this name. So the sandworm, Shai-Hulud, is a fictional form of desert-dwelling creature from the literary universe created by Frank Herbert. It's not necessarily a shared universe like the Cthulhu mythos, or have any connection to the Cthulhu mythos, except for the fact that they involve space, scary monster guys. I mean, there is some elements of, like, godlike ascension and stuff like that that is kind of part of Cthulhu mythos, but rarely with humans. Clark Ashton Smith. So let's talk about sandworms, Shai-Hulud. The Fremen, the natives to the desert planet Arrakis, also known as Dune, worship the Shai-Hulud as manifestations of the earth deity, and refer to them as Great Maker, the Worm who is God, and then, you know, names like that. Apparently they have a super long lifespan, thousands of years, and such worms are given names like Old Man of the Desert, Grandfather of the Desert, and Old Father Eternity. So let's talk about worms. Sandworms grow hundreds of meters in length, with some specimens in the deep desert observed over 400 meters. Although Muad'Dib did summon a sandworm that was over a league long, which would be, I don't know, 2,000 something meters? 3,000 meters, somewhere in there? I'm going to say it's closer to 3,000 meters as a league, but that's just me going off my, I don't know. Anyway, so they're incredibly tough, and the only way to really kill them is to administer high voltage shocks applied to each separate ring segment, or to blast them with atomics. Water is also poisonous to the worms, so good thing they live on Arrakis. Although here's a fun thing, I believe the water of life is made by drowning a small sandworm into water, and then what's drained out of it is the water of life. Water of life is used in ceremonies of the Bene Gesserit Sisterhood, which is space nuns of the Orange Catholic Church. And this is, I'm just going off of the top of my head right here. If I am incorrect about Dune, let me know and tell me where the Dune podcast is so I can check it out and be up to date on my Dune. Also, the teeth of the sandworms is used by the Fremen to make knives. If the knife is out of human touch for any period of time, if it's not close to something that gives off an electric signal, an electric pattern, something living, it starts to decay. But they can also be treated and used as pole arms. Frank Herbert notes in Dune that the microscopic creatures called sandplankton feed upon traces of the spice melange scattered by sandworms on the Arrakeen sands. Sandplankton are a food source for the giant sandworms, but also grow and burrow to become what Fremen call little makers. Little makers are pretty much also known as sand trout in Fremen mythology, and little makers, I guess what they do is they suck up the water, and what they excrete after they suck up the water is then what then starts to become the spice melange, but does not actually become melange until it's exposed to light and air. Machines mining for it freak out worms, and then the worms freak out and destroy spice mining, which, you know, is kind of a big deal to the Cho Mining Company. Alright. As I mentioned before, Fremen use the sandworms as transportation throughout Arrakis. And not really anywhere else, because it's really hard to transport a sandworm to another planet that has a totally different soil where the sandworms did not evolve. But here's the interesting thing. Fremen use specialized hooks to sink into a segment and then lift. To avoid getting sand inside them, the sandworm then moves that point up. You can then ride on the sandworm. And if you're watching the David Lynch film, you then control it with the old jump ropes from your elementary school, the black and white variety. A little thing about the sand trout, the little makers. Apparently, Arrakis used to be a water planet until those guys got there and messed stuff up. But that was a really, 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 really long time ago. And I'm not 100% sure if that is Frank Herbert's writing or one of his kids or anyone who ghost wrote something, so I don't know 100%. Sandworms. They're awesome.
You may be asking yourself, well, hey, DB, how come you haven't talked about Brian Lumley's Chthonians yet? You know, those things that are like super derivative of sandworms? Because this episode is about worms, not Chthonians. If I was going to do one about Chthonians, I'd do it. But Chthonians haven't arrived on the Earth yet in the timeline that I'm talking about. Yes, I know I did tell a story that took place in modern times, but it goes over quite a bit of history and tells when those Yakubians showed up on Earth for the first time. You know, there is another race of worms that digs around in the dirt. It, don't know how long it's been here, no fossil records. Don't know if it burrows down, if it feels like it's dying. They rely on something referred to as tremor sense, and they're scary as hell. Graboids. And before you start worrying too much, we will mostly just be focusing on the first Tremors movie, but we may briefly make mention of the other parts of the Graboid life cycle and just briefly mention other Tremor movies. And if you are familiar with the Tremor franchise and the television show and all that fun stuff, you know, I'm just going to kind of glaze past this stuff, just ass blast past it. Yeah, part of the Tremor cycle involves a thing called an ass blaster. Only watched about half of that movie. Yeah.
All right. Graboids. Graboids were created by Ron Underwood, Brett Manick, and S.S. Wilson for a little franchise known as Tremors. What a Graboid is well, it's the primary antagonist of the Tremors franchise, but creature first came around in 1990. The name Graboid was only mentioned a couple of times, but always reappeared in all of the sequels and in the television show. The store owner of the store that everyone hides out in the first movie, Walter Chang, played by Victor Wong, who names and then is eaten by the Graboid. Kevin Bacon's character, Val McKee, is the only one to use the term Graboid in the first movie, and Fred Ward's character, Earl Bassett, in the second movie. The creature is really, really, really similar to the Mongolian deathworm. Graboids are to the desert what sharks are to the ocean, according to someone on UGO.com. Or is that Ugo? I never know how to say that. Graboids have 3 stages of life. The first is the underground dwelling stage, dubbed the Graboid, and most well known. The second stage, and from I believe the second or third movie, is when a graboid leaves its underground skin, grows two legs, and then is called a shrieker. The third state is when they still have the appearance of stage 2, but with wings, and a tail that launches flame, dubbed the Ass Blaster. Graboids are ravenous carnivores that always hunt for food. Um, and it seems like they generally, what they want is living things. They want animals. They're not interested in plants. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't be digging around underneath deserts. But they do want. I mean, they'll eat. They'll eat dogs, horses, cattle, sheep, humans, coyotes. They'll pull down whole cars. They can. They're very strong. Yeah, if they eat something that isn't edible, they can spit it out with considerable force, like a swamp monster on Dagobah. Graboids tend to use ambush tactics or cornering to sneak up on their prey, and generally it's one or two graboids that are doing this. But as I said before, they what they tend to do if they hunt alone is they will isolate someone until they die of starvation and dehydration and then consume them. Really, really, really smart. Really, really good at learning. Really good at figuring out what's going on. Yeah. I would say that the Shriekers and Ass Blasters aren't nearly as intelligent. They don't seem to possess the intelligence that a regular graboid does, but then again, it's... I don't know. They're more like birds of prey, but not really smart prey. And the juvenile, and this is from Tremors 4, so I'm just passing over it real quick. The juvenile form of the graboids is a dirt dragon, but that wasn't brought out until Tremors 4, The Legend Begins, which I believe is a prequel to Tremors itself. The graboid's evolutionary origins are intentionally kept vague. The creators of the film were unconcerned with its detail, offering no explanation to where the graboids came from originally, wanting to avoid the typical B-movie cliches of, it came from an asteroid, or we found in Precambrian fossil records that. Pretty much avoiding kind of like the basic concepts of like the Cthulhu mythos. No one ran across a old newspaper that was from 1807 about like, a ghost town that appeared overnight. Nothing like that. And no like elderly Chinese people being like, oh, I've heard of this thing. In my land, it's called this. Oh no! But luckily, I have a book to defeat it. They didn't do that, and that was awesome. It wasn't so pulpy, and I like that because I have to deal with so much pulp to begin with. In Tremors 2, they do have a fossilized graboid spike found in Precambrian rock that dates back to at least 60 million years ago. And FYI, we're nowhere near that point in the Mythos timeline right now. We're still in like, 50 billion years ago the Yakubians landed? Yeah. I think the Tremors franchise is really fun. It's stupid. The latter ones are stupid, but the first one is awesome. I highly recommend, altering your consciousness and watching any of the Tremors movies. But I don't actually recommend altering your consciousness. It's just a fun thing to do when watching Tremors or bad movies like that in general. But yeah, I highly recommend Tremors. Check it out. The Tremors themselves are very similar to Brian Lumley's Cathellans. I mean, in appearance, they're fairly similar even. But yeah, I mean, Lumley took his idea probably from either Mongolian deathworms or from Frank Herbert. So there you go.
So, that's been it for People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos, and I have been your host, D.B. Spitzer. This has been a D.B. Spitzer production, recorded and edited by D.B. Spitzer. Thank you for listening. Find out more about the show at pgttcm.podbeam.com or go to the blog at peoplesguidetothecthulhumythos.wordpress.com or just simply Google PGTTCM. Thank you for your support. If you want to help the support the show more, you can always check out the shops on the blog and the podcast, which is pgttcm.podbean.com. You can like us on Facebook, follow us on the Twitter. We're on YouTube. Subscribe and give us 5 stars on iTunes, or just subscribe to us on iTunes. Like us. Give us some feedback. Give us a review. But if you don't want to wait the couple of days that it normally takes from iTunes, just go to pgttcm.podbean.com, download the Podbean app, and it'll let you know what's going on. I bet there are a lot of podcasts that you don't even know that you would like on Podbean. Did you know that Ken Hite has a podcast on Podbean? It's called Ken and Robin. It's awesome. Did you know that there is a really, really funny podcast out of Denver, Colorado called An Hour with Your Ex, which neither people are each other's exes. They're each other's exes as in, like, they're no longer boyfriend and girlfriend. They're now husband and wife. But Mel and Mark talk about all kinds of fun, stupid stuff, whether it be television shows, Jane Austen, WrestleMania, movies, whatnot, and they talk about how it relates to their childhood. One person has seen it, the other person hasn't, or they both love it, or they both want to talk about it, or it's things like, you should be watching it.
Again, that is pgttcm.podbean.com. Like us on the Facebook, follow us on the Twitter, give us 5 stars on iTunes. We don't have a jingle, we don't have a call-off sign.
I did not say this.